Circle. These are important efforts you guys are making in difficult times, and we should keep this effort going, especially in JNU. And so Venkat and Pradeep have already made my task easy in terms of explaining the history of neoliberalism and what neoliberalism is doing to economic lives, growing inequalities, nature of state, predatory nature of capital, and all of that. The question I am going to raise is that neoliberalism is not merely an economic model, is not merely an economic philosophy. There is also a social and a cultural philosophy behind it. So both Pradeep and Venkat ended by saying we should oppose neoliberalism and we should defeat it. I'll begin from there. How do you do it? How do you defeat and how do you overthrow neoliberalism? The assumption in political economy model generally is that when inequalities grow, distress, migration, other unemployment, poverty, inequalities will grow, and therefore people might resist. But what we have discovered over last 3 decades is that that gap between resistance and inequality is interpolated by culture and cultural beliefs. So it's not a rational assumption that merely that if inequalities go, people will resist. That is not what we are seeing globally. There are many other options people might take to when inequalities grow. And that's where our political question begins, that how do we then understand and bring cultural and socio-psychological factors into play in the idea of how to resist neoliberalism. So if you look at the overall shift globally also, this new importance to psychology. Why is there suddenly spurt of psychology and psychological studies? If you see the last 3 Nobel Prizes in economics, they all went to behavioral economics. Daniel Kahneman in his recent book, Thinking Fast and Slow, argues that human beings, earlier the assumption was that human beings are rational entities. Only in conditions of fear and emotions they become irrational. But he says his own study, 3-decade-long study, he says, discovers that in the basic cognitive mechanisms, basic everyday thinking of human beings, they can be prone to not so rational decision making. They can be prone to more intuitive beliefs. Neoliberalism today, I think, is working at that level, which is deeply personalized, deeply emotional, deeply value-centric, and therefore any resistance to neoliberalism, even any understanding of neoliberalism, cannot be without understanding these micro-culturological factors that are at play. So I will try to argue with you and persuade you as to how one can theorize that. What are those factors at play? And how is neoliberalism encroaching? And that is why we need to think the very idea of resistance afresh. Because the way we are expecting resistance to come, I think neoliberalism has understood that logic. And therefore it is culturally, continuously, contaminating and interfering with that notions of what is happening with democracy. What are the big challenges that have come? That democracy was at certain point considered to be a challenge to neoliberalism, because democracy after all works with the notion of citizenship, notion of political equality. Therefore, the 21st century, what we are facing today is that there is growing consent for authoritarianism. So the question that we need to raise, how did neoliberalism change this? From a consent to democracy in the 20th century, there is an overwhelming shift and growing social consent for authoritarianism in the 21st century, which is what we often refer to as populist authoritarianism. How did this shift come about? In my own writings, I have argued that there is a growing anomaly between the nature of social democratization that democracy has allowed. It brought in the principle of one person, one value, through political democracy, through gender equality, through caste equality, even on economic front through welfare state. So discursively, at the level of imagination, today all human beings aspire for dignity and social recognition. I think the success of 100 years of functional democracies all over the world is that it has successfully established this principle that every human being has basic dignity. Every human being has a right for self-dignity, self-respect and recognition. But what neoliberalism does simultaneously is that it removes those economic, material conditions, social conditions necessary to realize that notion of dignity. So there is this growing gap in your discursive imagination in your mind that I am equal to the other person. Today try talking roughly, disrespectfully to even an auto driver on the street. He will answer you back. 20 years back, an auto driver would have taken it. Help in the house would have taken your misbehavior. The sweeper who comes in the colony would have taken. Today I watch in my colonies regularly, middle class guys continue their old ways of behavior, But the good change is that you see a sweeper standing back and responding back. He does not think that somebody who is better off economically has more dignity than him. So this we'll have to acknowledge the success of democracy. But what neoliberalism does is it does not allow you to materially translate that imagination of equality and dignity in reality. So societies today in the turn of the century are collectively passing through this cultural trauma. That people increasingly go to remote, take any part of India, remote rural areas. Caste, we talk about caste repeatedly, but today you cannot misbehave on the name of caste. People will answer you back, whether they are economically weak, whether physically weak, vulnerable, socially vulnerable. But they also know that they cannot have that material, social, institutional condition to realize that notion of equality. What does such a condition do to human collective social responses? That is a question we need to ask. Do people naturally resist? Do all the people who think that they do not have equal opportunities naturally come together and form new multitudes to resist? Or is it that there is a possibility that there is a certain kind of social anxieties that might take over? Like the kind of anxieties your generation. I mean, your generation should understand this dilemma. All of you potentially good, getting fairly good education, but your future is something that will match up either to your talent or even to the opportunities you have got. Is that making you all more revolutionary? I don't think so. You're only organizing these talks. So it's a question your generation to ask yourself. Why do you not become revolutionaries? Because your experiences. So that's not an easy transition. Instead, what is your generation suffering? It is suffering from anxiety, uncertainty. What this anxiety and uncertainty does is that it transforms the way we social life. It transforms the way we see reality. I was recently out to watch this movie Homebound. She was also there in the theater. The first thing that struck me watching this movie was, had I been watching this movie 20 years back, I don't know, Venkat, have you watched it? Venkat is a serious Marxist. He doesn't watch movies. 20 years back, this movie would have invited empathy. 20 years back, this movie would also perhaps inaugurated anger. But watching today, I felt that this movie will increase anxiety in people who watch this movie. The question is not an empathy for those two guys. The question is, what if I become like them? Did you get the same feeling? There you are. That's the first thing that came to me. I mean, we are all on verge of such slipping. This is what Zygmunt Bauman writes. You should read his book In Search of Politics, where he says that why is immigration such a big problem in Europe? Not simply because immigrants are Muslim and they're hated. These are all easy, lazy theorizations. Immigration raises anxiety because every middle class person feels that I might be him tomorrow. I might become that homosexual that Agamben talks about, without bare rights. You can be open to the elements with no state protection. So increasing inequalities, growing poverty can change our responses to poverty. It may replace empathy with anxiety. So imagine a society that is increasingly sinking into anxiety instead of growing empathy. It is not an easy thing to go back. 20 years back, under welfare state. So all these emotions, whether empathy, compassion, revolution, radical responses, are all contextual. They operate in context. What systems like neoliberalism do is that they remove the ground for those responses. Today, expressing an empathy is not easy. Iqbal Saab is here from Jamaat. When I had an opportunity to speak at their organization, I told the same thing, that this growing communalism is also not merely an hatred of Muslims. It's not merely a simple-minded Islamophobia. Many of our secular progressive friends take that route, but I don't think it is merely a hatred of Muslims. It is this source anxiety at the head, that all our responses, whether it's gender, whether to caste, whether to Muslims, whether to other religious minorities, is driven by this impulse. Like when the moment you see weak people, our immediate response is anxiety. Our immediate response today is not compassion, because you are also in the grip of this notion. And that's why what neoliberalism is doing today is that it is pushing two very contradictory impulses, and that is the most dangerous thing together. Impulse of anxiety, impulse of animal spirits. But on the ground it's telling you that sky is the limit. There is no limit to your growth. So it will give you all these exceptional stories of rags to riches, how somebody became overnight a millionaire, somebody has left his job and started some homestay and has become a crorepati, somebody is selling apples, and that's capitalism, become a billionaire. So it on one hand tells you animal spirits, on the other hand it actually it's increasing your anxiety. This combination of animal spirits and anxiety, what does it do? When there is no upper limit, all human beings have identities are created in a relational context, I vis-a-vis you, right? Today what is happening is that inequality is not leading to anger. When I was in Bombay recently, to travel across and watch Ambani's Antilla, such an imposing structure, full of lights. I don't think people see it with anger. 20 years back that could have been the response. They would have thought this is grotesque wealth accumulated through wrong means. Today there is no higher limit to what you can achieve. In fact, no amount of wealth is giving you that sense of social security or dignity. You buy one car, the guy next to you has a better car than you. That guy has a comparison, there's a better car. So to all today there is no higher limit. Earlier there was social status was well defined through social markers. Today you don't have that. So what is the only way you can, what happens in such a context? When identities become fluid, social status becomes fluid, you do not know when you have arrived in society, you do not know when you have got that source of recognition, that is when you turn to those below you. You stop comparing to those above you. Last 10-15 years of neoliberalism, the greatest damage it has done in India is this change in social psyche. You stop fighting those who are more powerful than you, but you start turning against those below you, because that gives you a better sense of security, that gives you a better sense of dignity, that gives you a better sense of being who you are. So turn against the weak. And this is happening, cutting across. Therefore this old analysis of caste and class is not going to work. All castes are turning against those who are weaker. That's why my position on subclassification. Venkat sees this from a political economy angle, and I am seeing it through social cultural angle. Entire caste discourse has turned. Today I was recently at an MP's place from Bihar, from RJD. He was telling, sir, आगे और पिछड़े का लड़ाई खत्म हो गया, अभी लड़ाई है पिछड़ा बनाम पिछड़ा. And this is why this combination of animal spirits and this anxiety has done to us. Because notions of inequality can be articulated in very, very different ways. Why is it they're going to be, our future is going to be more about intra-caste and intra-subaltern conflicts rather than conflicts between the higher and the lower. That's what anxiety does, and that is where in the crevices of that neoliberalism will reproduce itself. So our challenge is much bigger now. Our challenge is that we don't have that kind of old certainty of how resistance can be brought about. Similarly, you should now ask third question. Cultural majoritarianism, Pradeep already spoke, pan-Hindu identity is being built. But the question that we need to ask in today's context is that what is the link between nationalism and consumption and consumerism? Cultural majoritarianism is curbing your civil liberties, but it is not curbing your freedom to consume. It is in fact inviting you to consume more. It is asking you to construct your identity based on consumption. You have just gifted me Nationalism of Tagore. I am tempted to write a strong rejoinder now. Because our scholarship, post-colonial scholarship, keep referring to Tagore. But that's not going to work, because the critique that Tagore offered of nationalism as chauvinism is an old critique. Today's nationalism finds its rhetorical legitimacy in consumption. So what is the interface between consumption and nationalism? Why does neoliberalism needs cultural nationalism, and why does cultural nationalism require neoliberalism? One obvious link is neoliberalism destroys citizenship, rights, language. Cultural nationalism and authoritarian state also wants the same thing. That's an obvious link. But there are some deeper links, project that you guys should take up at your generation, that why today's nationalism is built by the new market consumption. David Harvey talks about compensatory consumption. He says how new capitalism manages labor is by giving, it cannot offer no security of working conditions, it cannot offer equal wages, so it offers you compensatory consumption, continuous consumption. What does it do to a person with a mobile in his hand? I remember doing a survey 10 years back in rural areas close to Hyderabad, which were undergoing distress conditions. That's my district, which has maximum out-migration. So I was doing it with a Marxist. उसको पहले गांव में जाते उसके हाथ में मोबाइल देखते इसको गुस्सा आ गया मार्क्सिस्ट को. खाने के लिए नहीं है, बच्चों के लिए तुम मोबाइल लेके घूम रहे हो इसे. And the guy responded to him saying, भले मेरे पास खाने के लिए लेकिन मोबाइल जरूर है मेरे लिए. He associates his dignity and social status with holding a degree. You watch routinely when I come drive from my place to JNU, you have young people standing in bus stops, young girls. So you look at them, if they happen to look at you, they become suddenly conscious that they are in a bus stop, so they start looking at their mobile. Because mobile is equal. आपके पास वही मोबाइल है जो मेरे पास है, हमारा इक्वालिटी हो गया. So people find momentary notions of equality in various ways. The way you dress. Look at fashion trends. All lower middle class colonies, किशनगढ़ में जो बच्चे सुबह कॉलेज के लिए निकल के आते हैं, सारे low cut jeans, crop top, पता नहीं what are the new names I learned from my niece. वो बच्चे मुझे सिखाते रहते हैं, crop top चाहिए मुझे. Fashions are the same, cutting across classes today. Technology, fashion, access to education, of course, is a controversy. Are new ways people are trying to find a sense of social equality. So you cannot say that, mobile se kya hone wala hai. So consumption creates a very strange, we might call critical and empty notion of dignity, which is what feeds into hyper-nationalism. The more the backward areas in India, the more hyper-nationalist they are. सारा hyper-nationalism यूपी से क्यों आता है? रोशन like compensatory consumption, this is compensatory dignity. So human beings don't respond in a straight manner. You should read cultural sociologist Andrew Sayers. His entire book on moral foundations of class is on this argument, that people can find various ways of coping with inequalities, various ways of coping with indignities. जितना backward areas है उतना hyper nationalist है, because they'll find their dignity in that hyper claim. Pradeep said Hindu नहीं बनना है, but उनका पूरा dignity हिंदू में है. In my book on India after Modi, populism वाला किताब, I was speaking to this guy, our ATM, he is a Thakur. He doesn't have economic, he doesn't have education. What is left for his dignity? His caste. उसके पास एक ही है बेचारा, वो ठाकुर है, और तुम लोग उसके पीछे पड़ जाते हो, ठाकुर हो, ठाकुरवाद है, हाँ, मानववादी हो, वो और वायलेंट बन जाए. So this unevenness in social identities is creating havoc in Indian context. How do we face, how do we take on board? The question I will leave you guys to research. How do you make a Thakur a revolutionary in this country? बना के दिखाओ, तब neoliberalism को हटाने के बात कर सकते. Finally, the question of religion. But today religious consciousness is growing so far and wide. We might critique it through the angle of secularism, modernization, civil society, all of that. But I think there is a greater fit that has come about in your generation. I see a parallel process between neoliberalism, religious consciousness, and your generation of Generation Z, you are called, that's what you call? Gen Z. You Gen Zs are very difficult to understand. I have not seen a parent, a household where parents are not either worried or exasperated about their children. बहुत सारे कॉल्स मुझे आते, बच्चों को समझाओ, तो मैं बोला मुझे समझ में आया तब समझाऊंगा ना, ये सोचते क्या करते क्या. एवरी हाउस होल्ड हैज दिस कंप्लेंट, बच्चे बाहर नहीं निकलते, बात नहीं करते, they are indifferent. Only day before I went to do a podcast at a friend's place, with great difficulty invited his children, but they were completely indifferent to. He was बेचारा trying to impress the kids, बहुत बड़ा प्रोफेसर है, करता है, वो करता है, उसको कुछ नहीं था. तो होगा तो मैं क्या करूँ, मेरा मोबाइल का टाइम हो रहा, वो अंदर चला गया. Parents were looking at each other's face, very disappointed. So is this indifference? Is this new freedom? Is this an ethic of what they are? I call them the Nietzschean kids. Nietzschean kids, that they are believe in self-fashioning themselves. The good part of it is they think that we don't have to be dependent. हर घर में जाओ, आज बच्चे बाहर जाना चाहते हैं. They don't want to live with their parents, whether they have job or not. कहाँ जाएंगे पता नहीं है, लेकिन जाना है. So this whole idea of welfareism as doles, welfareism, Atmanirbhar. So you have this self-fashioning that has emerged as a new ethic in your generation. Religion is also very interestingly pushing the idea of self-realization as an individual pursuit. खुद भगवान को realize करो. So that's why you have cults growing. So many of this cult business, the Baba business, is that what these cults do is that they actualize this idea of self-realization. You have to realize God through your own individual pursuit. It is your effort. If you don't, that is your fault. Third is self-reliance in neoliberalism. If you actually see these three processes, economic, political, and cultural, religion is pushing self-realization as individual pursuit, and it is putting the onus on you. You have to realize the God. God is not going to come to you. In self-fashioning, Nietzsche would say, we have to decide our own goals. We have to be self-affirming. We have to take responsibility. Putting responsibility on someone, Nietzsche thinks, is slave morality. Don't allow society to decide for you. You decide. I think that has got into your generation. And then you have the neoliberal logic of Atmanirbhar, self-reliant one. So I think that the earlier post-colonial theorists thought that the idea of the sacred will kind of be a source to push back neoliberalism. They continue to do that in their writings. But today the notion of sacred itself has got commercialized. Look at the whole campaign on building Ayodhya temple. They said temple aayega to business milega. It is more, the title, the poster itself said it is spirituality with modernity. Earlier we thought these are both in conflict. But what right-wing mobilization is doing is that both market and spirituality come together. They are not mutually exclusive. Because the basic purpose of both are the same. Taking responsibility. Market, you become self-reliant because of market, and you have self-realization because of religion. So it's again a completely different challenge we are facing, that the convergence of all these three dynamics, I think, transforms the way neoliberalism and its legitimacy spreads. What you do have is a social and a civic crisis, but I'm not convinced that all of this is converging, as you know, Hart and Negri would say, into a kind of a new multitude emerging against global capital. That's not what is happening. I'm sure Venkat is also very optimistic on this. But I'm not. I don't think the process is so complexly mediated. And ruling classes, one should never forget this, that as we are meeting here and having meetings, ruling classes also meet in boardrooms. They also update themselves. And they're aware that these new sensibilities, as and when they come, capital also upgrades. Like your mobile update hota rehta hai, they also update themselves. That, and they have very conscious planning. I know some who are in the higher ups of Microsoft and others, I'm not going to name them, but when you sit in private conversations with them, they say that we are actually conscious of market. Entire marketing, those who do these marketing strategies, they are great social psychologists. That's what is Daniel Kahn's work all on. That how to make individual become a better decision maker. Entire new work is on that. How do people choose goods? Is it through the glitter of the advertisement? Is it through the smell? They have mapped everything. So emotions are being mapped today, which is what political leaders also doing. What is your Prashant Kishore? They tell you openly, mood dekh rahe. So that kind of a cosmetic, acculturation and calculation has begun even on the cultural and the emotional front. And these are the new challenges we are facing. And therefore, when we talk of neoliberalism in the 21st century, we'll have to talk about it also as a cultural phenomenon. That what it is doing to our everyday modes of thinking, how it tampers with our emotional make, how it is tampering with our value system, and how it becomes a new template on which we are already imbrued into it. And your generation should know this. That you might be ideologically critical of neoliberalism, but much of your practices that you are living in are already very, very neoliberal. Thank you.